June 1944. The night air trembles under a distant growl, not of tanks, but of engines. Thousands of them. Across the dark countryside, a river of headlights wins its way through the hedgerows and villages, snaking toward the front. Each beam cuts through dust and exhaust haze, revealing endless lines of olive, drab trucks, Dodge, Studebaker, GMC, their flatbeds stacked high with crates of fuel, ammunition, and rations. From a shattered farmhouse near St. Lo, 2 German officers stand in silence. Through binoculars, they watch the glowing serpent of supply convoys crawling relentlessly westward. "Is Rart nicht off," one mutters. It doesn't stop. The younger officer lowers his field glass, his face pale. He had expected Allied tanks and artillery. He hadn't imagined this. A logistical force that never sleeps, never runs out, never ends. By dawn, the roar of engines grows louder. And with it, a realization spreads through the German lines that this war would not be decided by courage alone, but by an army's ability to feed itself faster than the enemy could fight. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had become a contest of endurance. A struggle not merely of men and weapons, but of movement. The Allies had landed in Normandy and established a fragile beachhead. Behind them stretched the industrial might of the United States. A continent mobilized, a nation transformed into what President Roosevelt once called the arsenal of democracy. Every rifle, every shell, every ration box had to move. From American factories to English ports, across the Channel, and through the narrow roads of occupied France. It was an undertaking unlike anything seen before. In early 1944 alone, over 1.5 million American trucks were in production or service. They came from the vast assembly lines of General Motors, Ford, and Dodge, identical, replaceable, and reliable. Each one became a moving artery in a supply system that kept the Allied armies alive. For the men on the ground, logistics became the invisible front. While infantry and armor clashed along the hedgerows behind them, convoys flowed day and night. Engineers repaired bridges under fire. Drivers, many barely 20 years old, learned to navigate by blackout lamps and instinct. They drove through shellfire, rain, and exhaustion, knowing that if the trucks stopped, the offensive would die. In contrast, the German war machine was collapsing under its own complexity. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with exceptional discipline and precision, but by 1944, it faced a crisis of mobility. Fuel shortages crippled mechanized units. Allied bombers shattered rail networks, making resupply nearly impossible. Trucks were scavenged from civilian use, repaired with mismatched parts, and sent back to the front until they broke again. Field reports from German divisions in Normandy complained of paralyzing shortages of fuel, tires, and spare parts. One colonel described his regiment as a shell of steel without blood. Meanwhile, across the Channel, American supply officers were drafting plans measured not in kilometers, but in tonnage per day. They spoke in the language of mass, not maneuver. Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, was not just a military landing, it was the largest logistical experiment in history. Within days of D-Day, Allied engineers had built artificial harbors known as mulberries, through which over 9,000 tons of supplies were unloaded daily. But as the armies advanced deeper into France, these ports became too distant. The front moved faster than anyone had predicted. The problem was simple: how to keep an army of millions fed and armed across hundreds of miles of destroyed terrain. The answer was mobility. Trucks would replace railways, convoys would replace depots, and speed would replace stability. What began as an emergency solution soon became a doctrine. The Americans called it the Red Ball Express. a non-stop convoy system that turned the roads of France into supply highways. From Normandy's beaches to the front lines near the Seine, tens of thousands of trucks moved like clockwork. German reconnaissance aircraft that managed to fly over these routes reported something astounding. Columns of vehicles stretched as far as the eye could see. A living pipeline of steel and rubber, as one Luftwaffe observer described it. It wasn't a single convoy, it was an unbroken flow. To the German officers on the ground, the sight was both baffling and terrifying. They had studied blitzkrieg, the art of speed and concentration. But now they were witnessing a new form of warfare, where logistics itself became the weapon. The Allies were no longer advancing toward the front, they were bringing the front with them. As August approached, the German High Command realized that something fundamental had shifted. Intelligence intercepts confirmed that Allied supply output was beyond comprehension. What had once taken the Wehrmacht months to move by rail, the Americans could deliver by road in days. And as the columns rolled on, under dust, rain, and constant motion, the German officers knew the battle for France was becoming a battle of supply. It was not the tanks that broke their lines first. It was the trucks that kept coming. By late August 1944, the Allied advance had broken through Normandy. Paris had been liberated, the German 7th Army shattered, and the Wehrmacht was in retreat across France. But victory came with a new dilemma. The faster the Allies advanced, the further they drifted from their supply bases. Fuel became the lifeblood of the front. Patton's Third Army, a spearhead of mobility and aggression, often halted not because of enemy fire, but because its tanks ran dry. The logistical chain stretched thin across the ruined French countryside. Roads cratered, bridges blown, railways twisted by sabotage and bombing. The only option left was to keep the trucks moving, no matter the cost. The Red Ball Express officially began operations on August 25, 1944, the very day Paris was liberated. The name came from a railroad term meaning priority freight, and it would become one of the most iconic supply operations in military history. Nearly 6,000 vehicles ran daily, each marked with a red circle on its windshield, granting it right of way on all roads. These convoys operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, under a strict traffic system. One route east loaded, one route west empty. At its peak, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies every day to the advancing armies. Fuel drums, rations, artillery shells, spare engines, and even entire vehicles moved constantly toward the front. The roads became rivers of steel, a ceaseless stream of motion that fed an army spread across 200 miles of front. Most of the drivers were young and inexperienced. Many were African American soldiers serving in segregated units, assigned to transportation rather than combat. Yet their endurance became legendary. They drove through blackout nights, mud, and ambushes, often sleeping in their seats between shifts. The trucks themselves, GMC CCKWs, Dodge WC Series, and Studebakers, became as vital as any weapon. Mechanics kept them alive with whatever parts they could find, cannibalizing wrecks by the roadside to keep others moving. Meanwhile, the Germans watched helplessly. Luftwaffe reconnaissance was rare. Allied air supremacy kept most German aircraft grounded. But reports that did reach Berlin described convoys beyond imagination. One captured officer spoke of a continuous line of vehicles from horizon to horizon. The scale defied traditional military logic. The Wehrmacht had been built around railways, fast, efficient, and centralized. But the Allied system, decentralized and flexible, could adapt to destroyed infrastructure. It could move through towns, around obstacles, and across improvised bridges. The Americans didn't wait for the perfect road. They created it as they went. By early September, the success of the truck convoys was being felt across every Allied formation. Ammunition arrived on time. Fuel dumps never ran dry. Field kitchens had fresh supplies. The rhythm of war began to change. Commanders no longer fought to protect depots. The depots were on wheels, always in motion. German intelligence analysts, poring over intercepted radio chatter, began to realize the magnitude of what they faced. This was not the same enemy they had fought in 1940 or 1941. This was industrial warfare in motion, an entire economy rolling on rubber tires. One report from Army Group B concluded grimly. Enemy logistics possess a freedom of maneuver that renders our defensive measures ineffective. The river of trucks did more than carry supplies. It carried momentum. Every mile advanced meant more ground captured, more bridges crossed, more airfields secured. And as the Allied divisions surged eastward, the German command's reports turned from confusion to disbelief. It was here, amid collapsing defenses and endless columns of American transport, that many German officers first grasped the truth. They were no longer fighting armies, but systems, and those systems were powered by engines that never stopped. The stage was set for the turning point, when the flow of supplies would push the Allies to the very edge of their limits, and the German forces would confront the terrifying realization that no amount of courage could stop a machine built to never rest. Every convoy began not with steel or fuel, but with people, ordinary soldiers behind the wheel. For many, this was their first time leaving home. For some, it would be the last time they saw daylight, without the glare of headlights. The Red Ball Express became a lifeline manned by thousands of young Americans. Clerks, farmers, factory hands, suddenly transformed into truck drivers. Most were members of transportation units formed in haste, trained not for combat but for endurance. Yet their mission demanded courage equal to any front-line soldiers. Drivers faced relentless fatigue, poor roads, and the constant threat of ambush or air attack. With blackout regulations enforced, headlights were dimmed to slits, making night driving an act of faith. Convoys often stretched for dozens of miles, each driver following the faint glimmer of the truck ahead, praying it didn't swerve or stall. African American soldiers formed the majority of the Red Ball's personnel, nearly 75% of all drivers. They worked under segregated command, but carried the same risks as anyone at the front. Many units earned citations for bravery, others were barely acknowledged. But they drove on, often joking that, "We deliver under fire, in mud, and without glory." Theirs was a war measured not in kills or victories, but in miles completed without breaking down. Every crate of rations, every shell delivered, meant lives saved elsewhere. It was anonymous heroism, a quiet endurance that kept armies moving. Some soldiers called the convoys the ghost lines, because the trucks never stopped, not even at night. From Normandy to the Seine, they formed an unbroken rhythm of engines, the heartbeat of liberation. And for the German observers watching from ruined villages or forest ridges, that heartbeat became a haunting sound, proof that the enemy's strength was endless, and that every truck on the road carried the power of an empire behind it. To the Allied commanders, logistics was no longer a supporting role. It was the operation itself. Mobility became a weapon. General Eisenhower's staff viewed fuel not as a commodity, but as a form of firepower. They measured offensive potential in gallons and truckloads, calculating how far divisions could move before the next delivery. Each convoy was part of a larger rhythm, a living timetable of motion. Trucks left depots in Normandy, traveled along predetermined corridors, and reached forward dumps near Chartres, Dreux, or Reims. Military police directed intersections like air traffic controllers, ensuring the one-way routes never jammed. Even the simple act of refueling became a synchronized ballet. Mechanics timed stops to minutes. Officers logged mileage by the hour. To maintain this pace, the Red Ball Express was granted absolute priority. No civilian traffic was permitted. Bridges were reinforced, road surfaces graded, and breakdown units stationed every 10 miles. When bridges collapsed under the weight of constant movement, engineers rebuilt them overnight. The entire network pulsed like a mechanical organism, resilient, self-repairing, and constantly moving forward. The Germans, accustomed to centralized logistics and rail dependence, were stunned by this fluidity. Their intelligence officers struggled to predict Allied patterns because there were no fixed depots, no static lines to bomb. The front was fed by a mobile bloodstream that couldn't be cut off. As one German field report lamented, would destroy their railways. They build highways of their own. It was a new kind of warfare, one where the battlefield itself was shaped by transport, not territory. The Allies' tactical strength came not just from tanks or aircraft, but from the invisible infrastructure behind them, a structure built not of fortifications, but of movement. And as those movements grew faster, more efficient, and more relentless, the balance of the war shifted permanently. Beneath every moving convoy lay the pulse of American industry, the true engine of Allied victory. In 1943 alone, U.S. factories produced over 700 ZALs and trucks of various models, each part interchangeable with the next. These weren't custom machines. They were designed for replacement, not repair. Bolts, filters, and tires could be swapped between vehicles, regardless of manufacturer. Detroit's assembly lines had become extensions of the battlefield. Workers who once built cars now produced vehicles, faster than the Army could deploy them. Ford's Highland Park plant could assemble a complete truck every 2 minutes. General Motors plants in Michigan and Chevrolet's factories in St. Louis operated around the clock, their output exceeding entire Axis industrial totals. Every crate loaded onto a ship bound for Europe represented not just supplies, but a philosophy, a belief in scale. America had turned industrial abundance into a form of warfare. For every destroyed truck, 10 more waited at port. For every broken axle, thousands of spares lay in depots from Southampton to Cherbourg. This was what stunned German officers most when they examined captured Allied supply points. They found not scarcity, but surplus. Fuel drums stacked higher than barns, tires piled like walls, food packed in endless cartons. A captured German report described it as material wealth beyond comprehension. While German soldiers scavenged for parts, the Allies discarded what couldn't be repaired. Efficiency mattered more than thrift, speed mattered more than salvage. The waste horrified their enemies, but it was deliberate. The Allies were fighting a war of throughput, not conservation. The river of trucks was, in truth, a river of factories. An industrial tide that had crossed the Atlantic, rolled through France, and now surged toward Germany. It was the moment when war ceased to be about divisions and became about production itself. Behind the roar of engines stood the quiet discipline of planning. Allied success was not an accident of abundance. It was the result of organization. Leaders like General John C. H. Lee, the commander of the communications zone, LISOMZ, transformed logistical theory into living reality. His staff operated like an industrial corporation, with departments for transport, supply, repair, and communication, each synchronized to the front's needs by the hour. General Eisenhower understood, what few commanders before him truly grasped, that battles are won or lost long before the shooting begins. He famously declared, "Logistics wins wars." And in France, that belief took tangible form. Eisenhower delegated authority to the logisticians, allowing them to adapt routes, reroute convoys, and improvise on the move. There was no rigid command structure. Flexibility was the doctrine. German command, by contrast, remained rigidly hierarchical. Orders flowed from the top down, often delayed or outdated by the time they reached field units. While the Allies allowed sergeants to alter convoys based on local conditions, German quartermasters waited for written approval to change a route. A fatal slowness in a war of motion. The Red Ball Express itself was born from this doctrine of improvisation. When Patton's fuel demands began exceeding forecasts, commanders didn't request permission, they created a solution. Roads were cleared, routes mapped, and within days, an entire logistical artery came to life. German officers captured later in the war would express disbelief that such a system could operate with so little central control. To them, it seemed chaotic, but in that chaos lay genius. It was a democracy of logistics, where every driver was part of a larger strategy without needing to understand it fully. And through this decentralized efficiency, the Allies achieved something the Wehrmacht never could: momentum born of trust. From the German side, the view was one of mounting horror. Field reports from Army Group B and the remnants of the 7th Army describe scenes of disbelief. One intelligence officer near Falaise recorded that American columns moved like an endless serpent. Every hill revealed another. Every valley hid 10 more. At first, the German staff dismissed the scale of these movements as exaggeration. Reconnaissance flights were rare and dangerous. Smoke, dust, and Allied air patrols obscured visibility. But prisoners of war and civilian reports confirmed it. The Allies had turned every usable road into a supply artery. General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Rommel, wrote in his diary that the enemy's strength is not only in his air or his tanks, but in his ability to feed them without pause. Rommel himself, before being wounded and removed from command, admitted privately that he had never seen an enemy so well supplied. Their rear is stronger than our front. To German officers trained in the philosophy of Blitzkrieg, this was an inversion of logic. The essence of Blitzkrieg was rapid concentration of limited resources, striking fast, then reorganizing before the enemy could respond. The Allied approach was the opposite: vast reserves, sustained constant motion, leaving no pause, no recovery for the defender. Even captured supply depots astonished German engineers. They reported crates of ammunition stacked in perfect order, roads maintained to civilian standards, and gasoline drums arranged with mathematical precision. To officers used to rationing and improvisation, it looked less like an army's rear echelon and more like a traveling nation. By the autumn of 1944, many within the Wehrmacht understood the inevitable. The enemy had not only outproduced them, he had out-organized them. And that realization, more than any defeat in battle, broke their confidence. They could destroy tanks and guns. But how could they destroy a river that never stopped flowing? Every war has a visible front and an invisible one. For the Allies, the Red Ball Express became both a symbol of persistence and unity. For the men driving those convoys, it was an unending test of endurance and identity. In the long columns of trucks, soldiers developed their own culture, hand signals, jokes, songs, and a shared understanding of risk. Accidents were frequent, exhaustion constant. Yet the rhythm of the road became a kind of faith. If the guy ahead keeps moving, you keep moving. One driver later recalled. That's all that mattered. Morale was a weapon as powerful as any artillery shell. Knowing that the supplies would arrive on time, that hot meals, spare parts, and ammunition were always coming, gave frontline troops a psychological edge. Commanders knew this. Eisenhower made frequent visits to supply bases, praising the drivers personally. He understood that logistics wasn't only about movement of goods. It was about belief in continuity. For the Germans, morale eroded in proportion to the enemy's efficiency. Soldiers watched Allied columns rolling endlessly toward the front, while their own supply trains stood empty. Civilians whispered that, "The Americans have more trucks than we have rifles." Propaganda on both sides reflected the contrast. German broadcasts mocked Allied, mechanical armies, but soldiers in the field saw the truth: machines that never tired, never slept, and never ran out of fuel. In that sense, the river of trucks became a metaphor for modern war itself. Impersonal, relentless, industrial. It was no longer about flags or frontiers, but about who could move faster, sustain longer, and produce more. And for those who witnessed it, friend or foe, the sight of that endless convoy left one unmistakable impression: the war had entered a new age, and the human will was now measured in horsepower. By early September 1944, the Allied advance was reaching the limits of its own success. The armies had raced across France faster than any planner had imagined possible. Paris was liberated, the Seine crossed, and the German front collapsing eastward. Yet the farther the Allies went, the longer their supply lines stretched, and the more critical the Red Ball Express became. The great offensive hung in a delicate balance. Fuel dumps near Cherbourg and Normandy were now more than 300 miles behind the forward tank columns. Each mile advanced meant more trucks, more fuel burned, and fewer reserves. General Patton's Third Army, spearheading the southern thrust, was consuming 400,000 gallons of fuel per day. At times, it seemed the trucks were hauling gasoline only to burn it moving forward. Then, in the first week of September, came the moment of truth. Patton's army stood at the doorstep of the German border, near Metz and the Moselle River, ready to strike into the Reich itself. But his tanks ran dry. The convoys could not keep up. The Red Ball Express was already operating at the edge of endurance. Roads were packed day and night, vehicles breaking down faster than they could be repaired. Drivers averaged only 4 hours of sleep in 24. Accidents littered the routes: overturned trucks, burst tires, engines overheating from the constant strain. Yet still they pushed forward. At the port of Cherbourg, ships unloaded supplies around the clock, but bottlenecks grew. Each drum of fuel had to be handled multiple times, offloaded, stacked, reloaded, before it reached the front. A single delay rippled through the entire system. The river of trucks that had once seemed unstoppable now strained under its own weight. Meanwhile, to the north, Operation Market Garden was about to begin. Montgomery's bold plan to leap the Rhine with airborne troops and armored columns. It demanded enormous fuel reserves, diverting resources from Patton's drive in the south. The Allied High Command faced an impossible choice: feed one army's momentum, or sustain both and risk paralysis. On the German side, this temporary slowdown was their first glimpse of hope in months. Intelligence reports suggested that the Americans had outrun their supply lines. The locomotive has lost its coal. General von Rundstedt urged his forces to dig in, to hold the Siegfried Line and buy time. The Wehrmacht, though battered, still commanded formidable defenses inside Germany. In the fields west of Metz, American units waited, idle and frustrated. Tank crews sat beside their machines, playing cards or sleeping on turret tops. We could see Germany across the river. One soldier recalled, but we couldn't get there. We were out of gas. For Eisenhower and his staff, the crisis revealed both the power and fragility of their success. They had created a logistics machine, unlike any in history. But even machines have limits. The Red Ball Express had performed miracles, delivering more than 400,000 tons of supplies in just a few weeks. Yet it could not overcome the tyranny of distance. Then came the orders that would test the entire Allied system. Patton's advance was to pause. Montgomery's offensive would receive priority fuel shipments. Thousands of trucks were rerouted north overnight, their convoys redirected toward Belgium and the Netherlands. The Red Ball Express was split, strained, and pushed beyond its design. German officers, observing the sudden lull in the southern sector, believed the Allies had finally exhausted themselves. Their offensive has broken upon its own logistics, one report claimed. But they were wrong. The river of trucks had not stopped, it was merely changing course. Within days, new supply corridors opened through liberated ports like Le Havre and Antwerp. Engineers repaired railways to supplement truck routes. Fuel pipelines, built in secret under the English Channel, began pumping gasoline directly from Britain to the continent. The Germans could not comprehend it. Their own armies, crippled by shortages, were now facing an enemy who could reroute an entire war machine in a matter of days. What they mistook for weakness was, in fact, adaptation. By mid-September, the convoys were again rolling east. Lines of trucks stretched across France and Belgium, engines humming, dust rising, headlights flickering through the night. The pause had ended. The machine had found its rhythm once more. But as the Allies pushed toward the German border, a new challenge awaited. One not of supply, but of resistance. The next battles would test whether the river of trucks could sustain the greatest offensive yet, the push into the heart of Germany itself. And as dawn broke over the Moselle, the roar of engines returned, louder, deeper, unstoppable once again. By October 1944, the Allied armies stood at the edge of the German frontier, and the river of trucks that had sustained them was now a weapon of momentum. The Red Ball Express had carried the invasion from the beaches of Normandy to the gates of the Reich. But now, as autumn rain soaked the fields of Lorraine and the Ardennes, the final test of endurance began. The Siegfried Line loomed ahead, a dense network of bunkers, minefields, and dragon's teeth fortifications. The German army, though battered, fought with desperate ferocity. For every yard gained, Allied units needed thousands of gallons of fuel, mountains of ammunition, and constant replacements. Once again, the entire weight of the war pressed down upon the convoys. At forward supply points near Verdun and Luxembourg, truck engines idled endlessly as quartermasters counted fuel drums like gold. The convoys grew slower, the mud deeper. Rain turned the French roads into rivers of their own, but the trucks kept coming. They came through the Vosges, through Belgium, through shattered towns, where villagers lined the roads to cheer them on. For the drivers, it was a kind of purgatory. Days blurred into nights, miles into monotony. They navigated by faint starlight, or by instinct alone. Some trucks carried 5-gallon jerrycans stacked in precarious towers. Others hauled ammunition that could ignite with a single spark. A few were lost to ambushes or accidents, a tire slipping off a bridge, a convoy hit by stray artillery. Each time, replacements filled the gap without pause. And through it all, the Germans watched from the forests and hills, bewildered by the sheer scale of what they faced. Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilots reported columns of trucks, longer than entire divisions. The enemy's road network, one officer wrote, moves like a living creature. By late October, the Red Ball Express reached its zenith, more than 23,000 trucks, 6,000 drivers, and 12,500 tons of supplies per day. The sheer volume of movement stunned everyone who saw it. Even General Omar Bradley described the spectacle as a miracle of organization and endurance. Yet the strain was reaching its peak. Engines burned out, tires shredded, bridges collapsed under the constant weight. Mechanics worked in the open rain, with wrenches and blowtorches, patching engines under floodlight. Convoys began losing men to exhaustion, not from enemy action, but from the endless grind of motion. Still, the Allied commanders knew what was at stake. Every barrel of fuel delivered meant another advance. Every missed delivery meant another halt. The supply lines were now as vital as the front itself, and both sides knew it. Then, as the Allies pressed into November, the front exploded again. The Germans launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's final gamble. A massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes, aimed at cutting Allied supply lines and capturing the port of Antwerp. For the first time since Normandy, the trucks faced the possibility of annihilation. Snow fell thick over Belgium, roads froze solid, engines seized, and convoys were ambushed by German patrols disguised in American uniforms. The Red Ball Express was temporarily suspended, its routes choked by the chaos of battle. But even as the front bent under the German onslaught, new convoys formed behind the lines. Civilian drivers, engineers, and mechanics joined the military effort. Trucks, once used for rations, were repurposed for evacuations. Medical supplies, fuel, and reinforcements moved under constant threat. It was here, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, that the Allies' logistical power revealed its true resilience. Within days, damaged roads were cleared, convoys rerouted through side paths, fresh trucks poured in from depots as if summoned by instinct. The German plan, built on the hope that the enemy would run out of fuel and time, collapsed against the same force that had defined the entire campaign: the endless movement of supply. When the weather cleared in late December, Allied air power returned to the skies. Fuel deliveries resumed at full pace. The trucks, once again, flowed like a flood through the Ardennes, feeding Patton's counterattack that closed the German salient. Captured German officers later admitted that they had underestimated not just Allied numbers, but their capacity for endurance. One described it simply: "WOG broke their tanks, but never their roads." By January 1945, as the last remnants of the German offensive crumbled, the Red Ball Express had done the impossible. It had sustained an entire continent in motion, carried an army through mud, snow, and fire, and turned logistics into the very spearpoint of victory. When the trucks finally crossed into Germany, their engines scarred and their drivers hollow-eyed, the men who watched them knew they were seeing more than machines. They were witnessing the beating heart of a modern war, a heart that never stopped. And as the first convoys rumbled through the shattered ruins of the Reich, the sound that filled the valleys was not of triumph, but of inevitability. When the engines of the Red Ball Express finally fell silent in March 1945, Europe itself seemed to pause with them. The great mechanical river that had carried the Allied armies from the sands of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine had done its job, and done it at a scale never before seen in human history. In just 81 days of full operation, the Red Ball Express had delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies. It had moved faster than any logistical effort of the war, often outrunning its own maps. The trucks had traveled millions of miles, enough to circle the Earth several times. Every bullet fired, every tank fueled, every wounded soldier evacuated owed something to that unending chain of motion. Yet for all its triumph, the cost was immense. The men who drove the trucks, many of them African-American soldiers serving in segregated units, returned home to little recognition. They had endured fatigue, mechanical failure, and the constant threat of ambush without the glory of medals or parades. One veteran later said, "We weren't heroes with guns. We were the reason the heroes could keep fighting." Behind the headlines of victory lay a quieter story, one of endurance, improvisation, and the human toll of keeping a war alive. Drivers slept in their seats, ate cold rations, and went weeks without rest. Mechanics rebuilt engines under fire. Quartermasters rationed fuel down to the last drop. In many convoys, men learned to trust their engines more than their own strength. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine, and the Third Reich began to crumble, the Red Ball Express slowly dissolved into new routes. The White Ball and Green Diamond lines that continued supplying the front deep inside Germany. The trucks kept rolling through cities reduced to rubble, delivering food not only to soldiers, but to civilians emerging from the wreckage. The German population, starved and broken, watched in disbelief as the endless convoys thundered past. For them, the sight of so many functioning vehicles, all filled with food, fuel, and equipment, was a haunting vision of what they had lost. The Reich, which had once prided itself on its mechanical might, had been undone not by tanks or planes, but by a logistical system that dwarfed anything it had ever imagined. Captured Wehrmacht officers, interrogated after the war, spoke with a mix of awe and resignation. "It was not the artillery that broke us," one said. "It was the trucks. They never stopped. Even when our men thought the Americans must have exhausted themselves, another convoy came, and then another." The Allies' advance into Germany in the spring of 1945 was more than a military pursuit. It was a moving demonstration of industrial supremacy. Entire factories in Detroit, Cleveland, and Pittsburgh had built this victory. Every wrench, bolt, and tire had a lineage stretching back to the assembly lines of America. It was logistics turned into warfare, and warfare turned into inevitability. When General Eisenhower toured the captured German cities, he understood it well. In his after-action reports, he wrote, "The outcome of this campaign was determined as much by the supply line as by the soldier. No army can fight without food, fuel, and ammunition, and never has that truth been more vividly proven." The Red Ball Express became a symbol of that truth. It showed that the modern battlefield was not just a place of combat, but of connection. A vast, invisible web linking factory workers in America to infantrymen on the front. But even as the Allied flags rose over the ruins of the Reich, many of those who had driven the lifeblood of victory faded into obscurity. Their war was fought not with bullets, but with endurance, a struggle against time, distance, and exhaustion. And yet, without them, there would have been no victory to claim. The river of trucks had not only fed the front, it had defined it. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins. But amid the wreckage, the echoes of the Red Ball Express still lingered. The logistical networks it created did not vanish with victory. They evolved, shaping the very framework of post-war Europe, and the future of military operations for generations to come. The same convoys that once carried ammunition and rations now hauled humanitarian aid. Trucks rolled through shattered cities, bringing food to civilians, fuel to hospitals, and supplies to the millions of displaced. Roads rebuilt by Allied engineers became arteries of recovery. What had been born as a weapon of war transformed into a lifeline for peace. In the American occupation zones, the Army's logistical command, refined through the Red Ball experience, continued operating on an industrial scale. Rail lines were repaired, depots reorganized, and new transport routes established deep into Germany and Austria. Former battlefields turned into vast supply bases, feeding not an army, but a continent rebuilding from ash. For many of the soldiers who had driven the convoys, the war's end brought an abrupt silence. The endless hum of engines that had filled their world stopped overnight. The men who had lived on coffee, dust, and diesel now faced an uncertain peace. Yet, for all their exhaustion, most carried a quiet pride. They had sustained history's greatest invasion and delivered victory through sheer will and machinery. In later decades, historians would come to recognize the Red Ball Express not merely as a logistical success, but as a revolution in warfare. The campaign had redefined what mobility meant. It proved that modern war was not won by the number of tanks on a field, but by the speed and precision with which an army could move, refuel, and resupply. The lesson echoed through every conflict that followed. From Korea to Vietnam, from the deserts of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan. But there was another legacy, a human one. Nearly 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers, serving in a segregated army that often denied them credit for their courage. They faced racism both abroad and at home, yet performed their duties with unwavering discipline and resolve. Many later said that the Red Ball was where they proved, beyond doubt, that they were as capable and vital as any fighting unit in the war. It would take decades for that recognition to come. In 1992, the U.S. Army finally issued official commendations to surviving veterans of the Red Ball Express, acknowledging their indispensable contribution to victory in Europe. For many, it was a long, delayed vindication, a moment when history finally saw what had always been true. German officers who had survived the war continued to speak with awe of the logistical spectacle they had faced. In memoirs and interviews, they described the convoys as a force of nature. General J.U. Enther Blumentritt, a senior officer in the Western Front, would later write, "The Americans had achieved something no army in history had done. They made movement itself a weapon." By the time the war ended, more than 5.5 million tons of supplies had flowed through Allied supply lines in Northwest Europe. From the sands of Normandy to the gates of Berlin, the Red Ball Express had proven that logistics was not merely a support branch. It was the beating heart of modern warfare. When the last trucks were finally parked, rusting quietly under the spring rain, the men who had driven them left behind more than tire tracks. They had changed the nature of war itself. The Germans had been right to be stunned. For in those endless lines of trucks, those steel veins feeding the front, they had glimpsed the future. The story of the Red Ball Express is more than a tale of trucks and fuel. It is a story of endurance, ingenuity, and the quiet, invisible power that sustains armies. Across the shattered roads of France and Belgium, ordinary men became the lifeblood of victory, moving mountains of supplies that no battlefield, courage alone, could have delivered. In watching German officers stand dumbfounded at the endless convoys, one sees a broader truth about modern war. Victory is not determined solely by valor or firepower, but by the ability to sustain, adapt, and endure. Logistics had become a weapon, industrial might a force multiplier, and mobility a form of strategy. The Allies' triumph was as much a testament to factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh as it was to soldiers on the front lines. Yet the human story remains at the center. Drivers who slept in their seats, mechanics who labored in the mud, and quartermasters who calculated every barrel of fuel demonstrated that war is ultimately a human endeavor. Technology, machinery, and planning can extend reach and amplify power, but it is human resilience, the willingness to persist under unimaginable strain, that shapes outcomes. The river of trucks that flowed toward the front reshaped the very concept of warfare. It foreshadowed conflicts where supply lines, mobility, and logistics would determine success more decisively than numbers of guns or tanks. It transformed the battlefield into a network where movement, coordination, and endurance became as lethal as any weapon, and perhaps most poignantly, it serves as a reminder that wars are not only fought in moments of drama or heroism, but in countless small acts of perseverance. The drivers of the Red Ball Express were largely invisible in history, yet their contribution was monumental. They proved that sustaining life, fuel, and ammunition across hundreds of miles can turn the tide of battle. In the end, the Red Ball Express was more than a convoy. It was a testament to organization, industry, and human spirit. It was the pulse of an army, the lifeline of a campaign, and a force that even the most seasoned German officers could not stop. In the endless hum of engines, the war found its rhythm.